Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Charles Haywood, who is the maximum leader of The Worthy House. The Worthy House is an online publication where Charles shares his thoughts disguised as book reviews, and he maps the right-wing or anti-left sphere. I find his writing and his rhetoric and the way that he performs his writing in his podcast version of The Worthy House to be scintillating, entertaining, and thought-provoking, to say the very least. In this conversation, we talk about his worldview, his psychology, his spirituality, and what makes him tick. Absolutely check out his work, linked in the description below. Without further ado, here is Charles Haywood.
I try to avoid getting too crotchety. The problem is that it's such a target-rich environment, and sniping at people is always, it's easy thrills. So it's hard to avoid all the time.
Yeah, it makes it pugilistic and entertaining is a couple of words that I use to describe you.
Well, I do my best.
Yeah.
I'm a bit brighter there. Okay.
So, do you mind if we just dive in and
not at all
pal around while we do so? You succinctly describe your enemy, which is the left, having two principles. One being the forced equality of all people and the total emancipation from all bonds not continuously chosen.
Yes.
And while those taken to the radical extreme are certainly corrosive to society, and that's what we're watching happening right now, don't we want a little bit of choice? Don't we want a little bit of equality, right? Even equality of opportunity, so-called, which is even problematic.
Sure, but that's a false dichotomy, right? To say that the left desires the elimination of all unchosen bonds does not mean that we should have nothing but unchosen bonds. So there's a happy middle ground. This has been well understood for thousands of years in the Western and perhaps in Eastern traditions as well. I only say perhaps because I'm not up on Confucianism or Buddhism or what have you, but this idea that true freedom consists in living a rightly ordered life, a mix of liberty and restraint, is not exactly either rocket science or new. The new thing is the left's desire to turn the dial to 11 on the emancipation. Not that we should have a reasonable amount of emancipation. I mean, obviously the Greeks spent an inordinate amount of time complaining that X, Y, or Z made a man a slave. Now, they meant both overt slavery as well as being a slave to one's passions and so on. But what they wouldn't have said is the solution to a man being a slave to his passions is to have the government stop it. I mean, he was free to do that, but he was supposed to choose not to be a slave. So obviously, individual choice, you can't run a society without having a large degree of individual choice. Though at the same time, I think there should be a wide range of things that are if not forbidden by the government, stigmatized by society. And that's also the enforcement mechanisms for things that you're not free to do are also important.
Yeah. So how does one begin, like, with a positive vision of, like, order, and then which would be restraint, and then choice or emancipation? Like, where would you start to seed that value system?
You never start from a standing start, right? The state of nature where we all decided to meet and talk about how it was going to be is obviously a fiction. So the problem is that it differs for every society. Our society being so radically diseased and to one side of the spectrum faces a totally different challenge than, say, a society that has just gotten rid of John Calvin and needs to perhaps loosen up a bit would face, right? I mean, and of course the society at the same time faces a wide variety of other tensions and problems within the society. That is, this is not a united society or a society that has really even a significant amount of common loves anymore, any common goals for that matter. So where one gets started on these things is hard to say, because right now you can't just wake up in the morning and declare the era of emancipation is over and the era of less emancipation starts today. And we'll let you know what that means. And I mean, these things are obviously far more organic than that. They typically, however, on a kind of decadal, if that's a word, over decades, basis, I think, would start from a society that is in chaos or some kind of fracture with very small groupings. I mean, you're obviously the smallest grouping traditionally in this sense in terms of policing behavior, for lack of a better term. I mean, the term policing behavior has a bad connotation nowadays, but it shouldn't. I mean, everyone's behavior should be policed. If you're not policing your behavior at all, things have gone very bad for everybody. Though, of course, many people don't police the behavior, which is part of the reason we're here. But the family is the smallest unit of policing behavior. And by family, I don't mean so much the 1950s kind of distortion of nuclear family where what your parents or your aunts and uncles or your cousins may have to say has nothing to do with it. The extended family is really the basic unit of policing behavior. And informing that, typically when you have a society that does a reasonable job of restraint, is religious belief. It's an overused example, but the Amish are obviously the best example of this in kind of the modern American context. You may not want to be Amish. In fact, I was talking to a guy who lives among Amish the other day, and he said that Amish converts to being Amish are so rare that it's like news in 5 states when there's an actual Amish convert. But the idea of having a society that basically polices behavior, not by putting people in jail or making things illegal, though obviously that's necessary for some things, but simply by setting expectations, is really the only way to run a society that, as those groups get larger, has some commonality and can be run in a coherent basis. And what that would look like, I would say, for any successful society, can vary pretty widely. I mean, that doesn't mean there's no like magic ideological perfection where this is the level, these are the behaviors, everything is perfect now, and we can declare victory. I mean, everything is always going to be a continually shifting thing where you're just trying to hit the target and not miss too much.
Yeah. So if you look at the landscape right now, the ideological landscape right now, maybe I could preface it by saying Jordan Peterson comes on the scene and speaks directly, kind of more or less directly to young men. And he wakes up, I'm continually finding a lot of young people in their 20s and 30s who he instigated some sort of awakening or empowerment towards self-sacrifice and self-responsibility. And you have this kind of growing or latent field of people who want to build something, who look at the licentiousness of Pride, let's say Pride Month, and just like sexual licentiousness being forwarded by the same people who want to buckle down on free speech, buckle down on bigotry, right? So they want to control your behavior in certain respects and then give you free license in other respects. And it seems so extreme. They want some sort of middle ground. They want to opt into some sort of self-regulating behavior. If you were just to speak to that kind of very diverse group of young people who still have a lot of motivation, who still have a lot of ambition, what would you kind of lay in their path? Like if you want to urge them towards one thing or another thing, like towards one religion or another religion or one kind of value set or another set, where would you begin?
I mean, I think before I get to that, it's important to note that to the extent that the society or the left is constraining certain kinds of behavior that is viewed as bigotry, that those buckets are only things that are antithetical to the overall left values of emancipation. So I wouldn't say that's constraint in the traditional sense that we're talking about it here. But I think I'm getting to the question, the kind of tragedy of Jordan Peterson, who I admire a great deal, is that he's dropped this, that is, he's dropped appealing to young men or any deliberate attempts to appeal to young men. And so therefore, at least in my experience talking to people, the amount of people that he's able to influence in that way directly, though obviously his books are still out there, has sadly very much dropped off. And this is, you can tell this is true by the fact that the regime or the left no longer attacks Peterson because he's no longer a threat in the sense of inspiring young men, which was the danger that Peterson brought to the table. That is, historically, societal changes are wrought by dissatisfied young men who want something different. So I think that the difficulty for young men today, and I have several sons of varying ages and so on, so this is a real live question for me. The difficulty for young men today is there is no clear path. There's very few career paths. For example, well, let me step back. I'll start with the religion. I mean, I endorse Christianity because I'm Christian and I think Christianity is the true religion. So, but at the same time, I think that if you want to pick a completely different religion, that is infinitely preferable. And pick makes it sound like you're picking from a smorgasbord. I don't mean to suggest that necessarily, but any set of religious beliefs is going to help you restrict your licentiousness, unless it's a stupid set of religious beliefs. I mean, there are plenty of Christian brands, for example, which do not, in fact, provide any kind of moral framework that other than the framework that's on offer in the popular culture, and that's just a waste of your time. But I'm talking like a serious religious framework. For example, I have a friend who went off and disappeared one day, and I hunted him down through his son a couple of years later, and turned out he had become a Buddhist monk and wasn't taking emails anymore. So if you want to be a Buddhist monk, that probably is a pretty good way of fighting back against the culture being countercultural. But so I think you should pick up a serious religion, and you should study your religion seriously and practice your religion seriously. But in terms of, so I think that is probably the most countercultural thing you can do. But the fact is that unless you're a monk, you're not going to spend all your day in religious behaviors. I mean, it should color your life. It should dictate what you do in many of life's circumstances. But young men need to have a career. And by career, I don't mean a career like a white-collar career where you have a career. I mean that you have to do something with your life that involves giving meaning to you, providing for the people that you are expected to provide for, and hopefully leaving the world a better place when you leave than when you arrived. So in other words, the opposite of sitting around smoking weed and watching porn and playing video games after you work for 2 hours in your online job. So I think this is extremely difficult for young men. I've written a couple pieces on advice to the young, and talking about one of the things that always comes up is should people go into manual work of some kind, whether as a sideline or as a main line, and so on. So I have various forms of advice to young men, but I think all of the advice to young men is in a sense unsatisfying, because the current, if you become a devotee of Jordan Peterson and you want to follow his rules, you can do that in your own personal life. But when you step out the door and you interact with the broader world, especially if you're trying to work in a white-collar set of jobs, nothing you do that is Jordan Peterson-esque, if it can be identified as that, will be treated with anything but hostility by the vast majority of people that you encounter, by the HR harridans, by the harpy that's your boss, what have you, by all your friends too, who are sitting around smoking weed and watching porn and so on. So young men are basically in a holding pattern. That is, until society changes significantly, it's very difficult for young men to find a path in life that offers actual meaning. That's not always true. I mean, for example, I have a friend whose son is extremely interested in architectural ironwork. That's what he wants to do. So that's his talent. He's good at it. That's probably an outstanding career path right now. But traditionally, there used to be options like the military. But obviously, who wants to go into the military now? I mean, that's just crazy talk. If you want to go into no young man looking for meaning and doing the things that the military typically provides you would be well advised to do that nowadays. So the honest answer is I don't have a great set of answers. You can improve yourself all you want, and you should improve all yourself. You should do all the things. You should eat right. You should lift weights. All the stuff that gets pressed as being fascistic. But again, that will probably make you happy. It'll probably keep you from being as depressed as you might be if you weighed 300 pounds and smoked a lot of weed. But it doesn't give you. You're not part of an overarching societal framework. And until again society changes significantly, that's going to be an ongoing problem.
Well, that's the problem then. Until society changes, and society is usually changed by young men changing
Correct.
Society, right? So that's the feedback loop. So is it our responsibility as Gen X to just describe the cracks, or to send them into the breach, as it were?
Well, the problem is that look, I'm all for sending young men into the breach in the right circumstances. But I'm a big fan, as you probably know, of theories of regime fragility. That is, I am on team fragility as opposed to team turbo America. I expect the current regime to fracture in the quite near future, and for opportunities to arise. But you can't create those opportunities. And historically, what happens with young men who are dissatisfied and seek meaning is they tend to turn to either dissolute behavior, just thinking it's all not worth it, or forms of propaganda of the deed. I actually just did a review of Ernst Junger's *The Glass Bees*, which is a fictional work, but he describes in there, you'd have to get the backstory, but basically a guy who commits suicide in what is fundamentally, though it's not portrayed so in the book, interwar Germany, where a lot of young right-wing men were extremely unhappy, and guy who commits suicide because he thinks it's going to show people how self-sacrifice is needed in order to make a change, and he's just dead. Nothing changes. So pushing against the cracks when the cracks aren't open isn't a useful thing for young men to do. I think young men should be preparing to lead lives of virtue and leadership in the future. It's just that there's no avenues for that right now, so it necessarily creates an extremely frustrating environment. But there's really no path for a young man to look. I'm a huge fan of the electoral justice protest, the January 6th electoral justice protest. I think it was indicative of a variety of regime fragilities and so on. But the fact is that it didn't actually accomplish anything in terms of pushing at the cracks, and the regime didn't fall as the result of January 6th. So protesting per se isn't really a winning strategy. At the right moment, it's a 100% winning strategy, and that, as I've frequently talked about, is one of the main thing that toppled in 1989 toppled the Eastern European communist regimes, mass street protests. But those things have to develop organically. You can't wake up in the morning and say, today I'm going to lead a street protest and the regime is going to collapse because the secret police are going to scurry for the exits. Unfortunately, that's not the way history works.
Yeah. If you're speaking to revolutionaries in waiting, then one piece of it, or one set of advice, is how to wait, how to hold the line, how to prepare. And then the other set of advice would be when action is imminent, how to act, how to do more of an American Revolution rather than a French Revolution, perhaps?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the French Revolution was a disaster, starting with its ideological underpinnings. But the fact is that all revolutions, I mean, the old joke is that everyone who calls for a revolution imagines the revolution will happen around him while he stays perfectly in place with nothing changing for him. That's not the way it works in real life. But I'm a big Lenin fan, and not in the sense of like, I think Lenin is probably having a happy afterlife, but it's that Lenin had many qualities that one can learn from, and one of them was this waiting. I mean, he worked while he was in waiting, but he's been an awful lot, and Lenin's the guy who flipped a coin 20 times in a row and it came up heads each time. Many different things could have happened and no one would remember Lenin. But he was extremely disciplined about waiting, using his resources appropriately, not getting sucked into doing things because he felt like he needed to do something because the people, they need it. He was just very disciplined. One of my favorite Lenin episodes is obscure, where basically in the Finnish Civil War, the Reds were fighting the Whites soon after the Bolsheviks came to power. And in Russia, many of the Bolsheviks were demanding that Lenin send troops to help the Finnish Reds. And he said something, I can't remember it exactly, but basically sarcastic, like I don't have any spare armies right now. Instead of like splitting, he did like, well, we're just not going to do that because it's not practical. Even though ideologically, people who are ideologically motivated said he had to do it. He's like, that's not practical. And I think many people nowadays, and this is a function of, and this is true for young men, but for everybody, but since we're talking about young men, the problem is that young men have forgotten a lot of things. Their education tends to be terrible. To the extent they know stuff, it's autodidacticism, which can be very good. But the fact that you see this frequently in things like Andrew Tate, you see this in men's relationships with women. That is, they sense that the proper mode of life, whether it's with respect to women or anything, waiting, revolution, who knows, is gone. But they don't know what the proper mode of life is. And they know certain external manifestations of what the proper modes of life have been that have worked for other people in other societies in the past. But those aren't the modes of life, and those are organic. That is, to replay the 1950s, as I think it was A.P. Hartley said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And so the 1950s, to recreate the external manifestations of what you think the 1950s were like in your relationships with women is not a winning strategy. And worse is some of the Andrew Tate kind of stuff. I mean, I have a little truck with Andrew Tate, though I see why young men are attracted to some of his ideas. So this seems to me, whether we're talking about revolution or change or what have you, people gravitate to things they think are indicative of the way they should be behaving, but they don't understand that everything is simply the external window dressing, what's being generated by some organic thing that is harder to see. And you can't just recreate those things from scratch. It's very hard.
Have you thought about investigating the romantic aspect, like how men could be or should be in this time, in this place?
I'm actually writing a piece. I am writing a piece on marriage now, which I will have published in, if all things, are you familiar with Raw Egg Nationalist?
Yes.
So he has a magazine, Men's World. So I intend to, in the next issue of Men's World, to have a piece on marriage, which will have input from my wife as well. I have an extremely successful marriage, so I hope to at least I sure hope it is. All signs point to it being very successful, unless that noise I hear in the background is my wife packing. So she and I will work up this piece together. But she tends to be very involved in the background of a lot of the stuff that I do, though she's not an attention seeker like me. And I'm hoping this piece will be of use as a Gen Xer to some of these younger men in how they should approach things. Again, writing opinion pieces is not manifesting an organic whole, but can't hurt.
Yeah. Are you willing to breach some of that? Like, what is the content of a good marriage? How do you know? What are you looking for?
I just started it, but the way I typically write is I just throw things at the page, and then I'm like, what the hell is this? This is all crap. And then just like, shoof, it comes together. So it hasn't come together yet, but I think there's, so I can't really like give highlights at this point. But I honestly don't think that having a good marriage is that hard, in the sense that it can be, obviously, if you marry the wrong person, it can be nightmarish. But leaving that aside, you hear people say all the time that, well, marriage is hard and you always have to work hard at it. And I just don't think that's true. I mean, I don't think it's true for most people with the right kind of marriage. Probably the most important thing I would say for well, maybe not the most important thing, but an important thing, and this is something my wife and I have talked about, is that you have to have separate but overlapping spheres. And you don't want isolated spheres either. That is, you see this, for example, in men who, and we're getting kind of deep into the weeds here, but men who insist that they maintain all the family's financial books, and that the woman has little or nothing to do with them. And ever since we got married, I insisted, even though I have finance degrees and stuff, and my wife is less of a numbers person, I insisted, and she totally agreed, that she do all the household bookkeeping, because then she knows what's going on. I know all these people who they don't do that, and it makes no sense. So you have to have complementary spheres, and this goes in some of the other stuff that I've written on. But fundamentally, women should not have careers. That is, a marriage where both the husband and the wife try to have a career, in the sense of a striving career, is an extremely bad idea. But these are just random scenes from the upcoming piece. I may have more useful things to say. We'll see. Hopefully, I will.
Why should women not have her own career, or why do two partners? Why is it deleterious or negative on the relationship for two people to be striving?
Well, I mean, because men and women are fundamentally different. The internal drives of men are to succeed and to protect and to provide. As I always hector my sons, what is a father's duty? To which they recite, first to fight, last to flee. And so the job of a man is to protect and to provide, and a man gets self-actualization. I'm sure that's probably the first and last time I'll ever use that term in a positive context, but self-actualization from doing those things, And in the modern world, that means typically, or for many people, having a career. It may also mean having some other kind. I mean, career typically conjures up images of working in an office or what have you, but a career can mean a number of things. It can be truck driving, or something that's more traditionally viewed as blue collar, or it can be any number of things. And by the same token, a man is emasculated and is not self-actualized if his wife attempts to compete with him in those regards. Moreover, the wife then falls down in her responsibilities, which tend to be, are of necessity, should be, for a flourishing society, have to be focused around the internal dynamics of the family, both nuclear and extended. So in short, the husband should have a more public-facing role, and the wife should have the more private, inward-facing role. That doesn't mean the woman has to wear a burqa and sit in what's that, purdah, I guess was the old term in the Middle East for seclusion of women. And obviously that's the accusation that's thrown at you if you push this kind of separation. But everybody should play to his or her strengths. And when you pretend that men and women are the same, that they're driven by the same things, they seek the same goals, then you are necessarily eroding the need for men and women to each play to their own strengths. It's also true, for example, that women tend to be just worse at certain things. I wrote in a piece on entrepreneurial, and better at others, obviously, and on entrepreneurialism. There are very few successful female entrepreneurs, and not in the sense of running small, home-based businesses. In fact, back to medieval times, that was very common. But the personality characteristics of women are either not helpful or are absolute poison to successful entrepreneurship. And that's just a man. So if you say, well, men and women should both have careers and women should be entrepreneurs, for example, men are just much better at being entrepreneurs, which is the reason why in a marriage, if entrepreneurship is the way that the family wants to go, the man should be the entrepreneur. Having the woman do it is just a waste of time.
Speaking of entrepreneurship, part of your biography is going from being a lawyer and a clerk to starting your own business and starting
Correct.
up. What did you learn over the course of your business life? What were some, being a boss, managing people, dealing with the market? What are some of the wisdoms?
Well, do you have a couple hours? I can talk about this endlessly, but I think I learned an awful lot by running a business. So I used to be a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, but and I have a couple pieces on my site about this. But I used to be a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, but in Chicago. But it wasn't going to make me rich. I mean, it would have got me a comfortable income. It did get me a comfortable income, but I've always wanted to be rich. And so I started a shampoo making business from scratch, basically, and not because I knew anything about shampoo. It just so happened for reasons which I've explained elsewhere. I've learned all sorts of lessons, but I would say that the number one lesson for someone interested in entrepreneurship is that the key to success in entrepreneurship is not your education, it's not raising money, it's not any of the things that people typically will point to. The 90% of success in entrepreneurship is simply the ability to get things done. And most people just can't do that. Why? I just don't understand. So when I say get things done, I mean, if you make a list of 10 things that need to be done by 3 p.m., all 10 are done by 3 p.m. Most people can't do this. Whether it's not exactly procrastination or what have you. They also can't even create the list. They're passive. It's not just a question of getting things done. There's probably personality characteristics that are adjacent to this. But if you are the kind of person that can get things done, then if you're a doer, then you are likely to be successful in entrepreneurship, as most people aren't that way. No guarantees, and don't start a restaurant. Starting a restaurant is the worst entrepreneurial idea ever. Don't do it. But there are, and there probably are other bad entrepreneurial ideas, like starting a Twitter competitor, for example, is not what I would recommend for people for their entrepreneurial idea. And in general, I would stay away from tech. I did light manufacturing, and I think that there's a lot to be said for that. But I'm biased. But there's much. I mean, I'm happy to answer specific questions on it. I think that's the number one thing.
Just to nail into it, about being a boss, about being in charge of company and being in charge of other people. What were,
You have to have a certain personality. It's as my wife my wife likes to say, speaking of me, people either love you or they hate you. And I always joke, I hope that's not just code for everybody hates you. But no, I was fortunate in that I'm a terrible manager. Like, I don't like to manage people. I don't want to hear about your day. I don't want to do 360 reviews. I don't want to help you with your career. I want you to do the crap I pay you top dollar for, do it well, and ask me if you have any questions. So I think as a boss, it took me a while to understand this, but the number one thing that employees want, whether they're high-level partner-type employees or just some guy who's on the floor making $15 an hour, they want a boss who is predictable and decisive. Now, predictable can be, you don't want to be too predictable. I used to deliberately lose my temper once a year just on principle to show that it can be done. But short of that, they want someone who's decisive. Most people simply aren't decisive. And I like to say I don't have a lot of quality thoughts, but I do have an extremely large amount of extremely rapid thoughts, and I'm extremely decisive. So all an employee wants, if he or she comes to you and asks a question, is an answer. Doesn't want a long disquisition, doesn't want to be asked, well, what do you think? Let's talk about your feelings. No one wants that. They want an answer. And by the same token, they want to know what we are doing here. So the company I ran was a shampoo company called Mansfield King Shampoo and Hair Care. And we used to, it was a joke, but it wasn't a joke. If you asked any of the employees or any of the higher level employees, what is the mission statement of Mansfield King? Outsiders would expect some, we're going to make the world a better place, whatever. They would respond, the mission statement of Mansfield King is to put sweet cash in the pocket of Charles Haywood. That's the purpose of this company. Make Haywood rich. Everybody knows it. You get up and Haywood doesn't care about world peace, doesn't care about that. Make Haywood rich. But most people won't talk straight that way. Employees value this. They don't want to hear treating people like they're stupid is always a huge mistake. And you see this all the time. I think lawyers, I'm kind of treading for our field, but I think lawyers, if they can overcome risk aversion, tend to make good entrepreneurs because they can get things done. But what they tend to be very bad at is interrelating with people who are very different than them. Basically blue collar workers or people who are of a different social class. I come across as kind of hoity-toity. Obviously, I use big words and so on and so forth. But the key to dealing with people who are of a different social class is simply not to try to pretend to be something you're not, and to give people just plain, simple respect. That is, you don't give people respect by talking down to them like they're stupid. You're yourself, they're their self, and everybody's happy. And so, people don't want you to modify your behavior. People are happy to know what the mission statement of the company is.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick out making Charles Haywood rich. Is this a greed is good kind of thing? Is richness the end in itself? Why be rich? I mean, there's obvious reasons to it, but there's got to be a content there, especially if it's tied to your Christianity.
As the old joke goes, I've been poor and I've been rich, and it is true that rich is better. But I actually wrote a long piece on St. John Chrysostom. In the 4th century, wrote a book, or rather it's a series of sermons called On Wealth and Poverty, which I actually did a review of last year or early this year. So there's definitely a religious overlay to wealth. I mean, in the Christian context, wealth is historically extremely problematic. And so there's a lot to unpack there. But on a strictly secular basis, the purpose of being wealthy is to be independent. That is, I can write under my own name because I'm entirely uncancelable. I mean, short of shooting me, there's basically no way to get at me. I'm a completely skeleton-free person who doesn't need your money and doesn't have a job. So it's very hard to put Haywood out of business because I just can say whatever I want, and that's something that is impossible without having money. And there's other things you can do with money, but I actually spend less money now that I sold the business a couple of years ago. I spend less money now because what is there to buy? I mean, I have a house and so bizarrely, I worked for 2 decades to make a bunch of money, and that's great. I like money. I like money, as it says in Idiocracy. But I actually don't spend that much money. Maybe someday. I also assume that all my money will just disappear someday along with the federal government. So there's that.
Yeah. So with the independence that you've gained through being filthy rich or inordinately wealthy, you started your project, The Worthy House.
Yes.
You entered into a what was the goal when you began that? And like with this phase of your life, what are the things that you're learning and plugging into, especially not just with writers past, because you do a lot of book reviews, but also you're now in contact with a lot of public intellectuals. You're engaging with people now. So like when you began, what did you think you were doing, and what have you discovered that you're doing as you've done it?
Well, when I began, I was doing it anonymously, just under my first name, and I started writing book reviews, which initially were more book reviews than they are now. Now they tend to be launch pads for my ranting about one thing or another. But I originally started doing book reviews so I would remember the books that I read, because I do not have a good memory, and so writing book reviews helped me to fix in my mind the things that I read. But over time, it's become more political, obviously, and as part of an overall political, philosophical framework. And then when I sold the business and became uncancelable, I started doing it under my own name, which obviously gives you more reach and you make more contacts with people. So, I'm a small fish in a small pond of the internet, but I have more contacts than I used to with a lot people who are bigger names and much more important people. But I do it basically with giggles, in the sense that I'm not looking to monetize it. I'm not looking to. I don't want a job in the next administration of President X. I would never move. I don't go to conferences except very rarely, or go to events, or NatCon this or NatCon that, or what have you. I maintain contacts with a fairly large range of people, but basically most of my time is spent being a hobby farmer nowadays. I have chickens. I'm probably going to have small cattle. I run a bunch of pasture crops, well, not pasture crops, field crops, and I basically spend my time being a hobby farmer, waiting for. I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but waiting for.
Go ahead and do it.
Well, waiting for the spicy times to come, the spiciness, the nature of the spiciness to be determined. But I basically have this giant compound where I sit on it and am autarkic. That's what I do, and it's kind of fun. I spend time on Twitter and I write stuff and I talk to people, and I think that's amusing. But back to our earlier point, I'm not trying to change the world in the sense of like what I do is meant to help inform other people about. What I think is a useful way of looking at the world, both in terms of the information and philosophically. And hopefully that is of benefit to the world. I enjoy doing it. I enjoy learning from other people as well. But I don't have plans. People occasionally ask me, am I going to do X, Y, or Z, or go into politics or form some kind of organization? No, I'm not going to form some. I mean, not now. I occasionally think I should have like a organization in waiting so I can raise my warlord flag someday. But that seems like a lot of work. But I may have a few things along those lines, but nothing too specific.
So it sounds like you had your ambitious project, which was to get rich, and you've done that, and now you're surveying the land and just managing things, and then issuing your little pamphlets out into the world. But what have you learned? What are you seeing? What have you discovered in doing that? Have your ideas always been kind of basically left and right as they are now, and then just being fleshed out by the figures? So what
have I learned personally, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I've always been kind of on the right side of the spectrum. I'm old enough that I kind of came of political age when Ronald Reagan was still president, and in retrospect, Ronald Reagan didn't really do us any favors, and nostalgia for Ronald Reagan should not be encouraged, but it was a very different time. So I've kind of seen the entire arc of things. So for example, reading Christopher Rufo's new book where he talks about Derek Bell and these people in critical race theory in the early 90s, I remember distinctly how when I was going to law school, in the early 1990s, these ideas of Derek Bell were, in fact, this fringe thing. And I went to the University of Chicago, when we used to make fun of the people at Harvard because everyone at Harvard hated each other and the professors all hated each other, and it was, had a very poisonous atmosphere, and we congratulated ourselves on across the political spectrum all getting along with each other. I doubt very much if that's the way it still is at the University of Chicago, because the Harvard poison that Rufo identifies in his book spread throughout the land. But I think I don't know, I've learned all sorts of things. I haven't really changed my position of being on the right-hand side of the spectrum. I think my position has become more antithetical to the, very antithetical to the entire existing uniparty apparatus. That is, even like, as I'm very ashamed to admit this, I was a strong supporter of George W. Bush in like 2000 and 2004. I'm like, yes, George Bush is going to make it all happen for us. I cringe kind of when I hear myself saying that, and now I tend to, whenever I mention George W. Bush, I add "God rot him" in parentheses after it. But so I think I've become hostile to the existing political order across the board, even the putatively right-wing political order, in almost all of it, but not 100%, but almost all of its manifestations, regarding it all as kind of the rotten excrescence of a late-stage empire regime. So that Haywood of 2005 would have found that to be excessively radical, but Haywood of 2023 thinks, well, that's just kind of obvious. I mean, and it's historically obvious, and I was thinking this morning, talking to my wife actually, that all this stuff with Hunter Biden and the corruption of Joe Biden taking, I mean, all these things are obvious and no one cares about them, but maybe that's not that startling as you'd think. Maybe that's just the natural order of things. I mean, if someone described all this happening in, Equatorial Guinea, wherever that is, I imagine it's on the equator, given its name. If someone described this kind of stuff happening in Equatorial Guinea, we wouldn't think anything of it. Maybe that's just where we are. We're at the stage where it's not like some kind of tragedy that everything is stupid and that the ruling class is corrupt. It's just the natural order of man, and the exception is the thing that we're complaining about. It's gone. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I think all these people should be defenestrated and put in camps in Idaho for re-education to pick sugar beets or something, and then gradually reintroduced the population as menial laborers. But it's not a surprise that a late stage empire regime acts in this way, and getting all upset about it is kind of silly at some level. That doesn't mean I'm not upset about it, but it is true that it's the norm more than the exception. So I think I've learned things like that is the point. I think so I've become I'm more radical in that sense. I mean, I like Lenin, but I don't want to be Lenin. Part of the reason is I would make a terrible kind of dictator, because I'll be okay being like a kind of local level warlord in the right circumstances, but fundamentally I'm too religious to want to be a dictator. A dictator has to be someone who's comfortable basically killing a lot of people and worrying about his relationship with God later. I would be worried all the time, like every time I did something that ended in people being hurt, that Christ was going to judge me harshly for it. So that kind of makes me a weenie, I guess. But nonetheless, that's the way I approach it. So I guess I've learned that too, that I'm never going to be a dictator or king or anything like that. I'm just going to be some scribbler on the internet with maybe a local presence.
One of your not themes, but one of the writers that you've pretty much gone through almost all of his corpus is Charles Schmitt.
Yes,
and I go to you when I need to deal with Schmitt, because you give a good precise of him. Why Schmitt, and what other thinkers do you continually return to that you think need to be brought back or brought up again?
Schmitt is the prophet of political realism in the technological parliamentary age. So the reason that Schmitt is valuable is because he both avoids kind of the ideological blinders that are universal in American society, are not universal in European society, but so there probably are other people in European political philosophy who might write along the same lines. But he wrote a tremendous amount of things that, for maybe just randomly, are of increasing applicability today. So some of those relate to the question of why he has this book, The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, in which he discusses, obviously in the context of early 20th century Germany, the problems with parliamentarism within a nation that's very divided. Those things, and what he meant by parliamentarism is not exactly the same thing that we have, but the thoughts he has on these topics are extremely valuable. He also it talks a lot, for example, about the problems with ideologies with totalizing ideologies that necessarily mean that every conflict ends up in total war. People frequently casually quote Schmitt for the friend-enemy distinction, thinking that what Schmitt meant was that friends and enemies have to be distinct and therefore exterminate each other. That wasn't what he meant at all. I mean, Schmitt is a very subtle thinker, and there's lots of details which I try to go through in my pieces. His point was that you can't. Well, one of his points was that it's I think the phrase is something like the specific distinction that is not essential for, but the most important distinction in politics is that between friend and enemy, because that determines the fault lines. And he has a lot of things to say from that. But my point is that this is all a realist approach to things, as opposed to what we get typically in America today and have since at least the beginning of the 20th century, and we were infected before then, which is not a realist perspective. This idea on the right, for example, that America is a propositional nation, that all that matters is that everybody subscribed to the principles of the Founding Fathers, and then nothing else matters. There's no other axis on which people can be divided into friend and enemy. Or on the left-wing side of things, they have a utopian ideology, where those two characteristics you mentioned at the beginning are designed not just to be good enough themselves, but to create a utopia. And you have to understand that certain conflicts are simply irresolvable. And of course, the most famous, well, maybe friend-enemy distinction is the most often quoted thing about Schmitt, though, as I say, not astutely. But the classic Schmittism is, of course, sovereign is he who decides the state of exception. And this is the kind of thing that I think is at great play in the modern West, because we have an awful lot of pretenders deciding on an awful lot of different states of exception, and how exactly that interplay will manifest itself ultimately in kind of a final political disposition remains to be seen. But the times that Schmitt were writing in, basically the 1920s and 1930s in Germany, which were times of chaos, up until relatively recently in America, didn't seem to have a lot of bearing on us, right? I mean, what does Weimar Germany have to do with modern America? I mean, we're America. That's long gone. It led to Hitler. It was bad. I mean, but we can now see that we increasingly adopt not just the social and cultural, but more to the point, the political characteristics of Weimar Germany. Locuses of authority that are unclear, a wide variety of chaos. We haven't really hit the political violence part, but I mean, if history is any guide, political violence is the next step. And so Schmitt's thoughts on sovereignty and decisionism, that is how one should resolve some of these conflicts, I think are going to be of increasing value in in upcoming years.
Well, to aim at the resolution, I just want to kind of open up the conversation a little bit. So parliamentarianism, which is the assumption that people can just hash out differences. Like we'll represent these noble aristocrats that'll go and they'll talk through things and reason will win the day. And then opposed to that is this totalitarianism, which will enforce whoever wins totally and completely crushes all. The
first part's right, but the second part's not. So, I mean, the Schmitt's complaint about parliamentarianism and the kind of the locus of his complaint about the crisis. Though, in fairness, he doesn't use the word crisis in his book. The title is actually mistranslated from German. But it's more like the situation of today's parliamentary democracy. I forget the German word. I don't speak German that well, but I speak bits and pieces. And he called it the endless discussion. And this is also related to his earlier book of his Political Romanticism, where he basically complained that modern politics consisted of discussion, and that the point of being parliamentary system was that discussion would end up with the
Would lead to the best
answer.
decision.
Right, exactly. So on average, would come, but then in practice, this does not work, and in fact, it was just a disaster. But Schmitt did a lot of different things, so it's sometimes hard to say what exactly Schmitt thought. And he was a notorious self-promoter and not so much social climber, but political climber and so on, which is, he has a very bad reputation because when Hitler came to power, he eagerly jumped on that bandwagon too. But it was mostly because he did have political principles, but he was keenly interested in advancing himself. So sometimes it's hard to say what he really thought, and he changed his mind a bunch as well. But he certainly wasn't an advocate of totalitarianism. I mean, totalitarianism in the modern sense means state control of people's lives, or Mussolini's nothing outside the state, everything within the state kind of stuff. Now, Schmitt's point was that in exceptional circumstances, there's no mechanism to make decisions except someone basically deciding, I am going to make the decision and imposing it on other people. Not that person should then even continue ruling necessarily. In many cases, for example, Schmitt suggested that the Reich president make certain decisions that were outside the Constitution because they were necessary to preserve the German nation, but he wasn't suggesting the Reich president should then every Tuesday issue a raft of decrees ordering the nation. He was merely saying in this narrow situation, it's imperative a decision be made that is outside of the four corners of the Constitution in order to preserve the Constitution. And the Weimar Constitution was a notoriously complex document with contradictions and what have you, and he had a lot to say about that. But his point was that what we can't do is we can't point to some abstract set of principles, or we can't rely on discussion among people, even of goodwill, much less of ill will, in order to produce a situation or a decision that is best for a nation. And I think that if we look around us, this is pretty obvious. He did not say, however, that any decision was going to be better than those things. I mean, if we have Joe Biden making decisions, they're probably worse than no decision at all, right? I mean, this is just kind of obvious. He wasn't saying that this is going to lead to human happiness. Schmitt probably wasn't going to recommend anything was going to guarantee happiness. He was merely looking for something that, and this is, I think, another important political philosophy point, which is core to my own thinking, which is there is no utopia. We're always going to have not just problems, because problems arise externally, but we're going to have failures and injustices and all sorts of things that need to be corrected and should be corrected. And for example, in certain systems that are not democratic are easier to correct. Historically, when you have a king, for example, certain injustices are easier to correct. That's not necessarily to say that monarchy is the best, but correcting injustice is important. But injustice is always going to happen. There's no political system in which injustice just magically disappears, which of course is the claim of the left.
Mm-hmm. What about some of the resolutions or the positives that Schmitt provides, other than beyond the critique of what he's looking at?
Well, I think the critique is one thing, but I think his resolution, like I've kind of said it already. I don't mean to unnecessarily repeat myself, but I think his resolution is to understand that in all political systems there comes a moment at which the existing political system does not generate an answer that solves a crisis of itself. And at that point, someone not external to the system, perhaps someone existing within the system now, but someone outside of whatever the governing either documents or in the case of an unwritten constitution understandings are, has to make a decision in order for the polity to continue as a functioning polity and not to degenerate into civil war. Schmitt was extremely focused on avoiding civil war. And we kind of, again, this is something that probably seems more alive to us than it did even 10 years ago. But in 1930s Germany, this was obviously a live possibility because you had the extreme right wing and the extreme left wing literally fighting battles in the street, and you had other things which are lesser known in the various German Länder, the German states, not fighting each other, but various forms of civil conflict. And the finding a path through this that was not simply fighting wars was the most important thing to Schmitt. And so I think the studying Schmitt helps us in this process, because otherwise, hope is not a plan. And most of Americans are grossly uneducated, grossly undisciplined. I think America has a bright future. I'm an optimist in that sense. But there needs to be a lot of, you need to understand that Americans are largely adrift and have no idea about either history or politics or anything that matters. So assuming somehow that by crowdsourcing to the American public what our politics should look like will end up in a good result is the kind of thing that Schmitt would have laughed at, because that's not what happens. What you need to do is need to have the right people make the right decisions at the right time, which of course is easier said than done.
Yeah. When you think of America, we're a huge country. And we're a lot more diverse than we think. I mean, just culturally, from California to New Orleans to Indiana, and we had times where we were more unified ideologically. We were a Christian nation. We're not necessarily a Christian nation now. We're kind of a post-Christian nation. Do you think that America can or will survive as America? Do you see fractures being the better path forward, if possible, with like our military and...
If I was in the predicting game, I would say there's almost no chance America survives as America, simply because it only works at scale if it has a higher degree of unity than it does now, or that it is likely to be able to regain. And that would be true even if our ruling classes, both politically and in other areas, weren't completely rotten on any number of axes. There's diversity is not our strength, and as you say, Americans are diverse in so many ways that is problematic. You can get away with it for a certain period of time in ideal historical circumstances, say the past 80 years, so the past 50 years have been heading downhill rapidly. But I think people think that that's somehow the norm when that's really the exception. So if I was in the predicting game, it seems to me that the only viable future for America is to be the lands formerly known as America, and for us to give up our empire and to fracture into a smaller set of countries. Again, that sounds kind of glib and dry, and in practice these things are extremely painful, usually extremely violent, very difficult, tend not to be permanent fixes, though they can be in some cases. So I think that's the most likely future for America. These things, I always like to say, major historical changes are step functions, right? Like you say that, and I say that, and people are like, well, what's the path from here to there? But it's not like a smooth continuum where like one day you have a next traditional state. It's a stair step, right? One day we wake up and everything's different, usually due to some kind of external shock. I suppose if the aliens land and start fighting us, then America can unite in its new common goal of defeating the tentacled aliens. But since I don't believe in it, I think the chances that there are any intelligent aliens are pretty low, and I'm quite certain that whenever they're presenting in Congress today about aliens is total BS. I'm pretty sure that America's not going to unify to defeat the alien threat.
Yeah, but within your philosophy, your working philosophy, foundationalism, it's not a plan and it's not quite hope, but you do propose a great work as like an external goal, like
yes.
Space exploration or sea exploration or something like that.
Space exploration. So I'm
barring that, you don't think that America can unify if there's nothing above us.
I don't think America in its current incarnation can unify around space exploration. I would anticipate that the tenets of foundationalism, which is meant as an applied political philosophy, and so the idea is that I create these thought experiments or set of thoughts to offer to people who may find them of value and have the power to implement some or all of these things, which, as I say, doesn't seem likely it's going to be me. But hey, well, never can tell. Maybe I will end up being king. And maybe I was overly negative about being king earlier. Maybe now I'm swinging back to the positive. But no one's offered me the crown lately, unfortunately. And I think that you could easily imagine a successor nation. I don't think America is going to split up into 50 different nations, like the kingdom of Rhode Island. I mean, that's just silly. But there are certain natural division lines within America that would make sense. You could easily imagine an America which consists of a significant portion of old America, hopefully has a good relationship with other states, maybe works collectively on certain goals with other successor nations, for lack of a better term, and works on space exploration. The problem is that we'd have to completely replace our existing elites for this to happen. I think your average person, you would just have to be re-educated in a sense. Not re-educated, I don't mean in camps like in the communist sense. I mean adopt the new modes and orders. But we'd have to completely get rid of our elites. Like we put all our elites in California, and then we'd like dig a giant trench and not let them swim across it, and they could do what they wanted over there. And meanwhile, we could accomplish things. Since Elon Musk will be in Texas, we can continue launching space vehicles and so on. But in all seriousness, I'm a big fan of space exploration because it is a binding, unifying goal for a nation. And that's something that we simply have not had for a long time. And I doubt if it's possible to run a nation without that. I mean, if you're Putin, for example, you try to substitute Russian greatness and orthodoxy and so on. And those things are good up to a point in terms of producing national unity, and then you have special military operations to spicing it up a bit or whatever. But I don't think that is going to create a great civilization. I think space exploration is the only thing left that can accomplish that. You'd have to invent some new technology to make it feasible. And I've written at length on why it is we have declining technology in essence. So there's a long road from here to there, but I think that's an important goal. Whether or not we'll achieve it is hard to say. But then, of course, as Yogi Berra supposedly said, predictions are hard, especially about the future.
Switching gears a little bit, and since I have you on the line, why Christianity? Why is Christianity true for you? Like, what's the content of your faith?
It's true for everybody, not just true for me. I mean, well, I'm not an apologist in a sense. Apologist meaning someone who goes around convincing other people about Christianity. But I think that I mean, on a strictly personal level, Christianity strikes me as obviously true. I obviously can't replicate that for other people. So I mean, I just from a personal level, I believe in Christianity because I believe in Christianity, and that's of course circular. I think there's plenty of evidence that Christianity is true as well. But ultimately, I'm not one of these people who thinks that you can look in the archaeological record and prove Christianity that way. I think from a societal perspective, Christianity is associated with the flourishing of the West, which is the only civilization that has ever accomplished anything of note, in the sense that if it wasn't for Europe, we would all be living in the world of the 1400s. I mean, there's no evidence whatsoever that, for example, the Chinese would have ever developed anything beyond what they did. And you look at China now, and China looks pretty good compared to the West. It's not at all, but I haven't studied it lately, but certainly it was true as of like 10 years ago. Chinese innovation is essentially non-existent. They're extremely good at executing in the entrepreneurial sense, but I don't see that. I mean, you can never tell. Maybe the Chinese would have come up with the Industrial Revolution and what have you. But I think my point is that Christianity is interwoven with the West, and Christianity is good, aside from its truth, simply because it has a past record of inspiring a flourishing civilization, whereas other religions do not. Obviously, it's hard to separate out causation and correlation there, but I think those two things fit together. So, in my mind, that's why I recommend Christianity for the civilization. I will say, though, for the future flourishing civilization under foundationalism, but you could imagine a new religion. I'm not looking to start a new religion, but much stranger things have happened than new religions inspiring new civilizations. And in fact, not just stranger things, that's the normal course of things. If you read Arnold Toynbee or someone, that's his entire mechanism for civilizational rise, stultification, and decline. Or you could imagine a variation on it. I once saw a map, one of those maps where like the time-lapse maps over time that show the growing of different populations. Mm-hmm. And it showed, basically took the current trends and showed how by 2150 or something on current trends, all of the Western United States would be Mormon, all of the Eastern United States would be Amish, and it said something about the Great Amish-Mormon War of 2150 or something. so you can imagine one of those existing religions becoming. I think that we're extremely unlikely to have any civilizational rebirth without a religious reawakening of some type.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think Christianity is coupled or inspires innovation? What's the feedback look like?
That's actually a good question. Let me think about this for a second. Historically, and this is not original to me, people have pointed this out, a large part of, say, mid-medieval Europe, the economic rise of mid-medieval Europe was driven in part by the long-term view of monasteries. So, for example, the first great major public works projects, like draining of marshes, were undertaken by monasteries because they had a corporate view of the world. That is, the individual monk didn't matter. So I'll start this drainage project. I'm going to die, but who cares? My successors will finish this project. And I think Christianity in general seems to encourage a combination of individualism, but individualism exercised for the common good with a goal of obviously ultimately reaching theosis and divinization in the Orthodox Church with union with God, but that you're expected to do these things on earth for the glory of God. And the Western Europeans did this more than the Western Christendom did this more than Eastern Christendom. So I don't know if it's inherent necessarily to Christianity. That is, if you could ask Christ what he thought of this philosophy, it's not clear what he'd say. But nonetheless, the Western Christians clearly intertwined individual achievement with societal achievement with honoring God. And the prototypical example of that is cathedrals, but there were many other examples. And by the same token, they went in for colonization and exploration, in part for that reason. And there's a guy named David Gress, who's not famous, but he wrote a book that I reviewed a while ago. And he has one of my favorite quotes, which I quote all the time. He was talking about Cortez conquering Mexico. And he said, Cortez conquered Mexico for God, gold, and glory, and only a mundane imagination would distinguish among those impulses, for they were one and the same. So I think the Christianity tends to wrap these things which are disparate together in a societally winning package. Again, I'm not sure Christ is sitting there nodding his head in approval, saying, yeah, that's the way to go. You go, Cortez. But that nonetheless, as a societal accomplishment, Cortez's accomplishments are second to none or second to very few in Western history.
Yeah, that perfectly summarizes what we've talked about today. Your love of God, your love of glory, and your love of gold.
Yeah, that's probably why I keep repeating the quote. So it's probably my favorite. I don't know my favorite quote of all time, but it's certainly in the top 5.
What flavor of Christianity have you gravitated toward?
Orthodox. So my family and I converted to Orthodox. We attended Greek Orthodox Church, but Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is kind of the coming thing on the right. I was raised Roman Catholic and was raised very Orthodox, small Orthodox Roman Catholic, and then my wife was not, but we eventually ended up in Eastern Orthodoxy, which is a lot of kind of people on the right gravitate to Orthodoxy because it hasn't been infected to any significant degree with left-wing stuff. It's the only modern Christian church that's even remotely masculine. It doesn't have the, let's say, sexual problems of the Roman Catholic Church does in some areas, and even aside from that, it's masculinized to a degree that modern Christianity isn't, and it doesn't show much signs of being corrupted by modernity. So that's why people tend to end up there kind of on a political basis. But honestly, I mean, we like the Orthodox Church simply because there's more Christ in the Orthodox Church than you find in other modern American churches. Christ is the centerpiece as opposed to something else. They don't talk about politics. It's not like they sit around hectoring you about politics. The liturgy the Orthodox use is not entirely the same, but if John Chrysostom showed up from the 4th century, he would recognize what they were doing. So that gives you a kind of long-term view that is actually pretty satisfying in the modern world. Not that personal satisfaction is the gauge of how one should pick one's church, but that's kind of how we came to it.
Well, what do you see? Who is Christ, and like how is he depicted, or how are you brought closer to Christ?
Right. Well, Christ is the second person of the triune God. For those keeping score at home, sorry, that was I'm not sure if that joke was inappropriate or not, but the obviously Christianity is supposed to be centered around Christ, but modern Christianity, prototypically what is referred to as moralistic therapeutic deism, is not centered around Christ, but rather centered around the individual's satisfaction and, to use the term again, self-actualization, rather than Christ is died for you. And I'll come back to that in a second. Christ is God, part of the triune God, and this is how he wants you to live your life, and this is your goal is theosis, that is union, divinization, actual union with God, or technically with the energies of God rather than the essence of God. And I mean, this is a very kind of basic Christian set of beliefs that's been lost essentially among the mega churches and what have you. I will say, however, that, and this is a little bit inside baseball for Catholics and Orthodox, the view of Christ in the Orthodox Church is very different than it tends to be in Western Christendom, not doctrinally, but rather in emphasis. That is, the Roman Catholics in particular tend to view Christ's death on the cross and his suffering as somehow redemptive, and the emphasis is on how much Christ suffered. Whereas the Orthodox tend to, obviously Christ suffered for us, but view it as Christ victor. That is, Christ is the king who defeated death and opened the gates of heaven for everybody by going down to Hades and literally kicking the devil around. It's a much more kind of aggressive approach and less passive, and I think that leads a little bit to the distinction between the feminine and masculine emphases. That said, I mean, the Orthodox, like all Christianity, are, and this goes back to our earlier discussion, both men and women saints, icons and saints are extremely important to the Orthodox. And there are endless amounts of both male and female saints. There's no like male saints are better or more numerous or something like that. This is a complementary set of spheres in the church, as well as I advocate in society. And that sometimes gets lost. I mean, I don't really follow the Protestant churches. I mean, I have Protestant friends. I know I went to a Dutch Reformed elementary school, so I know something about Reformed theology, but a lot of these kind of debates about the role of men and women, I just don't follow because it's kind of beyond my ken.
So looking forward, you do a lot of essays. Do you think you'll be moving into like a book length project? Or
that's
like
a great question. I have teased a foundationalism book. I mean, it wouldn't be 500 pages. It'd be 150 pages or something. And for a while, I wasn't like, I'm not sure it's worth doing. And now I'm kind of thinking I should do it. So I don't have a book in the hopper. I have some outlines and so on. But I'm thinking a foundationalism book might not be bad. I mean, I don't think it'd be a bestseller, but given how miserable like Patrick Deneen's regime change book that came out a couple of weeks was, I think someone has to do a good book. So maybe I will. Maybe should I vote of one? Yes or no?
I would like it, especially if it's illustrated with like depictions of warriors conquering dragons and stuff like that.
Do you know who Jonathan Peugeot is?
Yeah.
So maybe I could get Peugeot or his brother. I think they do illustrations together. Maybe I'd get him to do some based illustrations for it.
Yeah. Any other recommendations for current thinkers that you find electric or opening up?
That's actually an interesting question. I of course think very little of most politicians, so we can drop all politicians. And I think Jordan Peterson is unfortunately fallen by the wayside. I do think that some of the kind of politically oriented people on the right, like the Blaze, TV network or whatever it is, with Matthew Peterson, had that very successful thing with the Republican candidates and the soon-to-be former candidate Mike Pence, who lives quite close to me, and not that we hang out. And so I think there's some exciting people on the right in that sphere. There's an outfit called Newfounding, run by a guy named Nate Fisher, that's doing a lot of good work on kind of career-type networks and business-type networks. In terms of thinkers and like philosophical thinkers, and this one, I don't know. I listen to a lot of different people. I listen to the Bronze Age Pervert podcast and what have you, and I find all this stuff interesting. But I think Dr. Seuss has a book. What wasn't his name? What was his real name? Seuss. Remember Dr. Seuss? Dr. Seuss. Yeah,
I can't remember.
So he has this book. I can't remember which book it is, but he talks about the waiting place, where like it's all the places you'll go, and it says all the places you'll go except if you end up in the waiting place, and you're just sitting around waiting. And I mean, he does it better than me with illustrations, but I think that we as America, not just people on the right, are basically in the waiting place now, which is part of the reason I spend a bunch of time farming, because so I can listen to podcasts, and we make contacts, and we learn things, and we educate ourselves, and we prepare for the future, but we're just waiting to see what's going to happen. And everybody knows that 10 years from now, America is going to be a very different place. And some people are like, well, it's going to be dreadful, or some people are like, it's going to be great, or some people, we just don't know. And I think that the frustration in a lot of what we're doing and in listening to people or following thinkers is, some of it seems ephemeral. Like, what does this really mean? We're just waiting to see what happens. Obviously, that can be accused of being passive, or you're a weakling because you won't get out there and march or something. But I think we're all just waiting. And so I think my actual advice to people is, well, I would consume political content, and I think it's interesting. Now, I would definitely consume like history content, like Daryl Cooper, Murder Maid's lengthy podcasts on history, which are outstanding. There's a lot of stuff. But if you were doing learning, I would focus more on the history than on the arc of the 2024 presidential election. And I think everyone should get outside and do some manual work, whether that's gardening or cutting down trees or what have you. I think people should get out in the real world as much as possible. That's really, I think, the soundest advice I can give to people, which is don't spend all your time on the damn computer. Do something that's real, and that'll help you in the years to come.
Yeah. So one step beyond just touching grass, like dig a ditch.
Right.
Lay some pipe.
Do something with the grass. Make something with the grass.
Absolutely. Charles, excellent. I love your stuff, The Worthy House. You're the maximum leader. Still don't know why you call yourself that, but I love it. I tell my girlfriend I'm talking to the maximum leader today. She's like, who's that? I'm like, you'll see. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll link everybody to your stuff. And if you want to end with another quote, either from yourself or from one of these contentious thinkers.
The people have probably heard this one, but I'll do a Lenin quote. So at the bottom of my website, I have seven quotes that encapsulate my political philosophy, and this is I believe this is not actually one of them, but I'll give you two Lenin quotes. One is on my site, which is "Timing is everything," and the other is a Lenin quote that is often heard, which is "There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen."
We'll see what's going to happen this week.